Hi, and welcome to Contextual Communications for Safeguarding. I'm honored to be chairing this webinar. My name is Semhal Getachew. I am National Associate for Safeguarding Resource and Support Hub in Ethiopia. The RSH Hub in Ethiopia is part of the global RSH Hub, who is more focused to support local CSOs with tailored services. Before joining the Hub, I've worked over 15 years for women's rights advocacy and gender equality, including prevention of GBV and transformative social norms for local and international NGOs. Currently, I sit in the middle of the challenge of context and language, as RSH Hub has started its page in 4 local languages. This webinar is a knock close to my door as much as it is for you. Before we start the webinar, a few notes on housekeeping. First up, you're all on mute with your videos turned off. This is to support with the quality of the connection. Please be aware that we will be recording this webinar to share on the online hub afterwards for anyone who was not able to join. Some of you have started asking that question, and here is your answer. Your names will not be visible though at the end when we share it. There is a closed caption available, which you'll see as CC at the bottom of your screen. And the caption is very good, as there's a person who will be doing that. We're happy to hear from you. So please use the Q&A tab, the question and answer tab, to forward your questions, and also upvote questions already asked by others. We'll try to address as much questions as we can at the end of the presentations. Please also be advised that this webinar contains references to sexual assault. In today's webinar, we'll be looking at safeguarding and communication, specifically on sensitive translations, words and word choices, and visual aids. In order to do that, we have invited 2 speakers who will be talking to us through all the key points in this webinar. Our first speaker is Alice Castillejo, who is a programs advisor at the Translators Without Borders. She has worked in the development and humanitarian sectors for the last 28 years in the field of governance, education, health, and advocacy. Alice now leads Translators Without Borders work on protection against sexual exploitation and abuse, and in the education sector. She's worked also on translating safeguarding, including a project that works to translate key SEH concepts into 100 different languages. Alice will be talking about what we need to consider when we translate safeguarding terms and messages into different languages. And our second speaker is Desiree Bartosiak. Desiree is a global head of the Safeguarding and Habitat for Humanity. She's also worked over 15 years, and she has a practical leadership experience specializing in complex and cross-sectoral programs in development and humanitarian aid in Africa, Asia, the Caribbean, Europe, North America, and the Middle East. She was part of the team that produced the interaction-funded visualization toolkit for key concepts of protection against sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment. Desiree will be talking about how we can communicate key safeguarding messages visually in a way that will be recognized and understood in different cultural contexts, and what it takes to develop these visual aids. I now take you directly to the presentations. Alice.
Thank you very much, and thank you for that lovely introduction, Semhal. I'm very happy today to be presenting a session about safeguarding translation. And as we're going to be talking about words, I'm going to start off just explaining that for the purposes of all of today's presentations, we are using safeguarding as a general term to discuss the protection of people from sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment. Next slide, please. In this presentation, I'm going to set out how language contributes to vulnerability to sexual exploitation and abuse, and people's capacity to report it and to access support. And I'm going to talk about the practical steps that we can all take to overcome language barriers in our work. Next slide, please. So first, let's just remind ourselves why language matters. We're very used to looking at factors such as poverty, age, gender, and disability as drivers of vulnerability. But speakers of marginalized languages often experience many layers of disadvantage: access to education and healthcare, representation, perhaps access to technology. And each driver of vulnerability compounds the next. So in many societies, women will get less access to education and fewer chances to learn other languages. Poor educational provision for disabled people might limit their access to communication options. And all the world over, we know that poverty translates to low literacy and therefore to less access to the languages of wealth and power. So an impoverished woman with disabilities who speaks a marginalized language could be the very last person to know how to report sexual exploitation and abuse, or how to access the service if she needs them. That means that marginalized language speakers can be some of the people we most need to reach to prevent sexual abuse and exploitation, but they can also be some of the most difficult to reach. Next slide, please. It might sound fairly obvious, but when you've got limited resources for translation, the first crucial step is choosing the right language. Next slide, please. This slide shows the assumptions that get made about language when data isn't available. The figures in the slide represent results from a survey of over 170 international and local humanitarian staff and more than 600 Rohingya community members in Bangladesh and in Rakhine State in Myanmar. In that response, the central communication problem has been an assumption by aid agencies that most Rohingya understand Chittagonian, Rakhine and Myanmar languages, which are spoken in Cox's Bazar and the Rakhine area of Myanmar. Local staff in Myanmar and in Bangladesh assumed that their own languages could be understood, and this information was passed on to international colleagues. There was a lack of attention to the details of the differences between the languages and cultures. For example, interpreters in health centres didn't recognise that chest was being used as a euphemism for breasts, and so medical staff couldn't get accurate information to make a diagnosis. And likewise, words for help and pregnant, for example, are not the same in the Rohingya and the Chittagonian languages, although the languages are closely related. So assuming that the languages were close enough was a serious error that could have potentially resulted in people being unable to report sexual abuse. Next slide, please. In the cyclone responses in Mozambique in 2019, aid organisations mostly tried to communicate with affected people in Portuguese. But as this map shows, in that province, most affected by the cyclone, and in fact, most affected by the recent conflict-related displacement, only 1 in 5 women understands Portuguese, and even fewer can read and write it. During that time, we mapped the language data for the most affected provinces and conducted an assessment on people's languages and communication preferences. This helped responders know which languages and formats to use to communicate with crisis-affected people. And it led to participants scaling up a multilingual reporting hotline and using pictorial and audio communication to promote it. It's really, really important to gather language data rather than to assume that you know what languages are spoken. This work might sound daunting, but it actually can be done by just adding a few basic questions during routine data collection. Questions like, what is the main language you use at home? Or which language do you prefer to receive written communication in? It really isn't very hard to get the basic information that will then inform all of the language planning. The important thing is to collect it rather than to assume that you know it. Next slide, please. To get good translations, the other important thing is to start from the best source material. Next slide. Plain language is a recognized discipline of writing, which helps the reader to understand as quickly and as easily and as completely as possible. When you use plain language, you're trying to make your message clear and to present it in an organized way so it's easy for the reader to find what they're looking for. It favors short sentences and familiar words. Plain language helps all of us, whatever our level of literacy, to reduce our reading effort. Not only this, but the clearer your original document, the stronger any translations are likely to be. Next slide, please. Here are two parallel texts of one of the PSEA key principles. TWB worked with the Interagency Standing Committee responsible for the principles to create a plain language version, which was easier to understand. We've gone on to translate this into more than 100 languages. The process was not without challenges. We had to consider our choice of words carefully, and after much discussion, for example, the term sex worker became the word prostitute. Despite the stigma associated with the word, we recognized that it was much more likely to be understood, and we had to choose comprehension over the risk of causing offense. At TWB, we don't advocate for creating an original text and then a plain language version. We actually believe that all humanitarian material should be written from the beginning in plain language. And we should all only need to read something once to have understood it properly. And again, just to remember that the plain language document is likely to improve your final translation. Next slide, please. So we need to remember why it is that finding the right words is a really vital part of successful communication. Next slide, please. Let's just think about how we use words to show our status or to give respect or perhaps to hide our embarrassment. And once we start thinking about how we use it, we can begin to understand how much words matter. So just taking an example from the women's world, we just think about, for example, how I might use different words to discuss menstruation and how we might use them differently if we speak to a doctor or how we speak to our friends. And then let's talk about how we talk to children about their bodies or about sexual issues. And we can see how quickly we might use different terms again from the ones that we would use with friends or doctors. There are lots and lots of terms in every language which are problematic for different reasons. The word for rape in relevant languages is only ever, in some languages, is only ever used to refer to violence by a man against a woman. And it might not be the right word to use to discuss violence against men and boys. You may need to consult and find an alternative, for instance, torture, that participants might associate more readily with male rape. Research with the Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh found that some words were just too taboo for women and girls to say, and so they were using euphemisms like staining or oppression or dishonor to refer to forms of abuse. The local aid workers understood those terms, but not their real meaning, and so cases weren't being reported and the women didn't receive report. There was fascinating research done by the Women's Refugee Commission in 2018 into male rape, and that highlighted that when they asked refugees if they knew of men who had been raped or sexually abused, most people said no. But when the researcher left out the word sexual and left out the word rape, and instead they asked if torture was done against men's private parts, people opened up. The research was clear in its findings that many men had no idea that what had happened to them was sexual violence. In our research, both in Nigeria and in the Rohingya community, we found words that men and women used separately and that the others didn't know. Next slide, please. Avoiding unfamiliar words in our source text is the first step towards getting a good translation. If you've sprinkled your document with words like mitigation, gender, mainstreaming, you're going to make your translators' lives very difficult. Once you start with plain terms, and then you need to test out your early translations to see if people from your target audience can back translate them accurately. Ask them to use their own words to explain the meaning of the text that you translated, and then you can go back and adjust it if the meaning you intended wasn't that was being understood. You should need to discuss sensitive words with the groups that you're trying to communicate with and to choose the best understood and the least stigmatizing terms. And it's really important to take time to understand how concepts might be understood differently by different people. Once you've agreed the terms, try and get them used by as many partners as possible to build up consistency. Next slide, please. To get the very best translation and interpretation, we need to support the people who are doing it. Next slide, please. So our final topic, which is supporting staff. In most situations, translation and interpretation is done by bilingual volunteers and staff who have very little support. It's often added to somebody's normal job without consideration of the additional time involved or the skills needed. It's a difficult role, and training in the core skills can help people manage it better. This training might typically cover things like note-taking or managing miscommunication, the ethics around interpreting, and managing terminology. It's obviously important to make sure staff are made aware of language issues. In a recent UNICEF CAS study on sexual exploitation and abuse in DRC's Equateur province, awareness of reporting mechanisms was very low, partly because language hadn't been addressed properly in promoting the feedback mechanism. Some women also said that language was a barrier to making complaints because perpetrator maybe spoke French, and as they themselves didn't, they believed they wouldn't be listened to. Training staff in language awareness, as well as in the skills needed for translation and interpretation, can overcome these challenges. Next slide, please. Just to close, I've put on this slide some resources which I really hope that you'll find useful in addressing language and safeguarding. Also, Translators Without Borders, we're always there. Do feel free to reach out to us if you'd like any more advice on these language issues. And with that, I'm concluding my part of the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Alice, very, very much for this wealth of information and for cautioning us not to assume and also to stay as plain as possible when we are trying to put the documents together. And I now ask Desiree to present hers.
Well, many thanks to Alice for sharing your years of experience and expertise, and for the Resource Hub for hosting today. Go to the next slide. This part of the presentation will cover visualization and why this is crucial to enhancing understanding of safeguarding and key concepts. We'll first look into why visuals are important, and then explore some of the best practices and lessons learned through utilizing the Safeguarding Community Visualization Toolkit. Now, the next slide will actually use a visual to help show you why visuals are important. A human processes visuals 60,000 times faster than texts. And studies have shown aids can improve learning by up to 400%. In fact, 90% of all the information transmitted to the brain is visual. The next slide takes it into the terminology of safeguarding and why using visual is important. Accessibility. This is one of the key premises of safeguarding and our accountability to affected populations frameworks. Different people process information differently. Perhaps you are a visual learner, an audio learner, or you do better when you're able to read something. Transmitting information in multiple forms can help ensure better receptiveness from your intended audiences. In addition, we know that oftentimes as humanitarian and development agencies, there'll be various levels of literacy within the communities we're working. And visuals can help counter this. Now, it's important to note that within accessibility, visuals do exclude those with visual impairments, and simply utilizing a visual does not make a document accessible. Visuals can also enhance quicker, simpler communication. Much of the study that Alice just talked to earlier highlighted the need to have shorter, more informative documentation, something that utilization of visuals can lend itself to. I think we all know within the safeguarding world, our messages are complex. Thus, the simpler and quicker we can convey these complex messages, the better. Additionally, visuals help us retain information longer. Words are processed by our short-term memory, which can typically only retain of information at a time, while images are processed directly by our long-term memory, thus ensuring that that information is stored for longer. I want you to consider using images within your safeguarding messages as an effective way to transmit those complex messages to both your staff and communities. Visuals can also support comprehension, help learners grasp concepts by stimulating imagination and cognitive capabilities, helping that user process that information faster. They go beyond mere words and literally show our brain a picture. For safeguarding awareness building, it's crucial not only convey a message, but that the recipient understands and internalizes that message. Visuals can also prompt emotions. Emotions and visual information is processed in the same part of the brain. Visual stimuli and emotional responses are linked, and actually those two generate together what we typically call memories. Hence, powerful images and visual metaphors create strong impressions and lasting memories in learners. Abuse and exploitation is personal, as the impact on that individual and their ecosystem is long-lasting. We want to ensure that the key awareness building and messages we're trying to convey are understood by hearts and minds. Now, the next slide is a little bit of a fun way to show you quickly, as we're trying to talk about what vision can do, how our brains are pre-wired to automatically interpret relationships between objects, allowing for an almost instantaneous comprehension with minimal effort. I want you to think of how long it would take you to talk to or explain in writing what these visuals are trying to say about size, orientation, and color, versus what this one visual can do very quickly. Now, the next slide is going to take us beyond just why we should use visuals, but give us some lessons learned or best practices in terms of visuals within a safeguarding context. The first and the next slide talks about ensuring that we're making our plans and testing of materials. It's important for the design and testing of visuals, including conditions. Simply put, the creation of good visuals can be costly if a solid plan isn't in place. In fact, for this toolkit, our initial plan was for 9 key messages and 22 illustrations. Yet we ended up with 11 key messages and 36 visualizations. Now, we ended up with that because we did a rigorous amount of testing. We actually did 4 rounds of feedback and redrafting, and starting with the premise that these were already pre-vetted characters. These were characters that were already utilized in the No Excuse for Abuse video produced by Interaction. We specifically went out and found 109 different respondents representing 25 different countries to test these materials, to ensure that the visuals, what they were showing, the key messages conveyed, were actually showing what was intended to do so. Within that feedback, we were also able to understand which visuals had the highest scores, which were the most successful in conveying these very complex topics, and replicate those key traits within others. You'll see on the screen here the difference between round 1 and round 4 of a key message. The next slide talks to the of localization of visuals, particularly when we're talking about the people or culture depicted in it. Can people see themselves in those visuals? Based on our discussions with team members throughout the globe as we were creating the toolkit, we mapped out some of the key considerations in terms of dress, cultural traits that needed to be honored, as well as understanding what some of the key safeguarding violations were. Now, we know that these selection of characters don't represent all that needs to be represented, but as we talked about in the previous slide, there were budget considerations for round 1. We do hope that round 2, once funding, will be able to expand further. So for example, we knew that this was not fully depicting things such as hairstyles, and we were limited and we were only able to show females in wheelchairs and utilizing crutches. However, with that collection of feedback, we were able to intentionally be inclusive for conservative dress, girls with disabilities, pregnant women, varying ages of men, and varying facial hair that was told was very important to the users. The next slide talks about a different concept of localization visuals. It talks about representation and nuances from an environmental perspective. They're important. A person can dismiss realities because they don't see themselves. Just as the previous point stated, that visuals must reflect reality, that reality needs to be tailored to the specifics of a community or a circumstance. So within our pre-work, we looked at some of the most common settings where aid projects would be present and designed interchangeable backgrounds for these specific contexts. So there are rural settings, urban settings, outdoor settings with mountainous terrain, forestry, farmland, and even low-income housing settings with corrugated roofs. The next slide still talks to that concept that visuals should reflect reality. Because we heard from our audiences that visuals needed to reflect that reality or perception of it to resonate with them. The visuals should be positioned in a way that supports the person conceptualizing the message and how it relates back to him or her. So if we look at the visuals on this slide, we need to ensure on the one on the left that the anti-harassment visual took into account the most current form of sexual harassment we're seeing within the sector, and that's via mobile text. The middle visual talks to how relationships with those under 18 need to be considered, but we went back and forth several times in how. So we were able to utilize backpacks and kids playing football to be able to depict that. The last shows no sex for employment, and upon testing, actually a construction site resonated the most to be able to depict this. The next slide basically reminds us that visuals and texts should complement each other. So what's being said in the text needs to be reflected in the visual or layout of how they complement each other. If we want those visuals to be impactful, they need to be easy on the eye and reflective of that text. The next slide reminds us that visuals can't stand alone. Just as mentioned before, that our visuals are best when accompanied by texts, it's also recommended that it's combined with other awareness building efforts, such as trainings and community meetings. And it's crucial you remember to train your own staff on how to use those visuals and tools properly to achieve maximum results. The last key lesson learned I want to share with you all is that you can utilize your visuals to challenge complex norms. In particular, within this toolkit, we chose to challenge the norm that females cannot be perpetrators. Thus, within the depictions, we switched, and this is part of the reason why we had more images at the end than we intended, to have both females as perpetrators and men as survivors of abuse. Now, just to note, we have received feedback from some particular testing sets that this was not well received by certain cultures and countries, but we don't think this is an issue of the visuals themselves, but more of an awareness building that females can be perpetrators and not the graphics. So in closing, I hope you found the overview of how to use visualizations helpful. And we're hoping that you will find the safeguarding toolkit helpful. On the screen now, you'll find a series of links to the full toolkit itself, the information guide, and also a video itself on how to utilize that toolkit. Thank you for your time and attention today, and absolutely thank you for supporting the safeguarding efforts.
Thank you, Desiree, for that wonderful presentation. really appreciate both speakers for trying to bring together this cumbersome journey of tying the language in terms of words and visuals together. I encourage participants to keep forwarding their questions. And in the meantime, we start now with our question and answer. I'll start with the forwarding some of your questions which you asked about who should be involved with the translation work and what happens when there is no agreement on a specific word. Alice, it'd be wonderful if you could share some thought about this. And I'll keep asking the questions out, read out the questions, and I'll ask Alice and Desiree to respond to these questions. In the meantime, participants, keep logging your questions. Alice?
Thank you very much, and that's a very good question. Okay, so who should be involved in translation? I guess our first recommendation would be that you need to look at the people who the material is aimed for and be trying to work with them around getting some of the key concepts described in the language that they're familiar with. And I guess slightly shamefacedly, I'm going to start with an example. So when we very first began our response in Northeast Nigeria, there was very little professional translation capacity. And we started by using people from the universities as translators. And we got very elegant translations, which were in fact using a very kind of a refined form of Hausa, which was not suitable for the community that we were serving. So we've also learned through our experiences in this, it's very important to consider the age of the people you're putting the material for. So if you're aiming, for example, at adolescents, if you can get some adolescents to discuss the terms that you're going to be working with first and create those, you can then pass them on to a translator who you might be working with. The sort of sociolinguistic group that you're working with, and making sure, of course, everyone who's involved in translation is the first language speaker of that language, so that you get people who are really experienced and understand the nuance and the kind of the baggage that comes with a particular word. So I would say make sure you're using men and women, make sure you're using different age groups, and make sure that you're getting people from the particular kind of social group that you're aiming the material at. And all of those people should be involved in the testing process of translations. Thank you.
And can you say a bit about also what happens when there is a tie and nobody agrees on a specific term?
Yes. There isn't a right and a wrong answer to this, I'm afraid. In the end, there is often debate over words and disagreement, and it's true across all the languages. So, you know, we in this sector have spent plenty of time talking about how to discuss some terms, and the discussions go on. And in the end, you have to pick the one that you feel is the most sensitive and is likely to, you know, to cause the least offence and certainly to do no harm to the communities you're working with. But in the end, a choice has to be made, and so. There isn't a right and a wrong way of finding that final term. Good luck with it.
It looks like Semhal might have frozen, so I'll just take over while her connection rejoins. Hi everyone, I'm Lucy Heaven-Taylor and I work for the Resource and Support Hub. So I will continue with the questions while we wait for Semhal's connection to return. Oh, here she is. I think we've lost Semhal for the moment, or we're getting a delayed response. So a few questions, I think, to Desiree about the visual communications. So I understand the bureaucratic importance of having the same visualizations across projects around the world, but for conveying clear messages, it seems that the visuals should be adjusted so that they are understandable in the local context. Desiree, what's your response to that comment?
Absolutely. And we would absolutely encourage that where budgeting and resources allow, it's always contextualized to the local context. the toolkit wasn't to say this is what you all should be using. It was to say, in absence of key resources already out there, let's provide this open source that can even further be contextualized, right? So basically starting off a platform to say, here is, if you don't have any, but please do take it forward and contextualize it to those specific community needs, because that will mean that your visuals and messaging and awareness building resonates further.
Thank you. And a very specific question here. During the consultations, did respondents understand thought and speech bubbles and what they convey? And were there any challenges with this?
Great question to whoever asked that. We actually tested it in two forms. We tested it, you first received the visual with no thought bubbles. So you just had to say what you thought it was conveying. And then the second part of that testing was, now we gave you the thought bubbles and you had to determine if it was reflective. That way we were able to not necessarily corrupt the testing and receive both back and forth. And just really want to highlight and thank Alice and her team with Translators Without Borders, because they did all the really heavy lifting within that key messaging and being able to test that as well.
A question here for both presenters, so I'll leave it between the two of you to decide who responds. Regarding positive versus punitive language or visuals, what's the better approach? Say, instead of telling people that e.g. sexual harassment is bad, is it better to show the benefits of an alternative behaviour?
I'm happy to look at that from a language perspective. I think from a language perspective, I don't think there's an issue. I think from our angle, what we would talk about is, you would need to convey very clearly which one of those you've chosen, and to make sure that whichever choice you've made, you're making a very good translation of it, and that your meaning is very accurately conveyed between one language and another. I think the behaviour change specialists would have a much better insight as to which method is going to be more effective with which audience, and I don't think that's specifically a language question.
I would agree with Alice here, particularly in terms of it depends on the setting, the culture, as well as the, quite frankly, risks that you perceive in a community and how best a community will receive that information. And most importantly, what Alice just said, who is the intended audience? Are you talking in terms of a staff perspective in raising awareness, or from a community perspective? And I think that is very interdependent in terms of if you talk about it from a positive or penal. And also want to encourage you that it's not one or the other. It's not a binary choice. Oftentimes we marry those together because it is the most effective.
Thank you. A few questions about communicating with children here, so I'll pick one of them. Often young children do not know or understand sexual abuse. Could there be possible communication tools in terms of language and visuals for awareness building that could reach out to children in the 5 to 10 years age group?
Yes. Okay, take the language part of that first. So as I was using as an illustration when I was doing the presentation, the words we use to talk to children about their bodies are very often different terms. And I think the 5 to 10 is a particularly tricky age group that you've chosen, because that tends to be the period in which people evolve from children's terminology into adults' terminology. So you might have to break down your audience quite carefully in your conversations, and perhaps start the conversations with parents first about the terms that they feel comfortable using and the terms they're choosing in their household. And at our very limited work on this, I have to say we haven't done a lot of work around with children on this, is that it can be very varied in different households about how people talk about these issues. But I would definitely say start by talking to parents about the words that they feel comfortable and how they express these issues first before you would do testing with children. That would be my recommendation.
Desiree, anything to add there?
I think Alice said it wonderfully, and acknowledging very much that communication with children is distinctively different than communication with adults. So from everything from the language that you're choosing, that if you choose to use visuals as well, ensuring that that is tailored in a child-centric manner, as well as protection manner. We're not exposing children to information and ideas before they are ready to process them. So explaining that's in an age-appropriate manner, and absolutely, as Alice just stated, with that parental consent and with cultural consideration.
Thank you. Quick fire round question for Alice. It looks like plain language favours active versus passive sentence structure. Yes or no?
Yes.
Is there a reason for that?
I think it's clearer for most people to understand. It's just a clearer form and engages the reader more directly in the activity.
Okay, great. I think one more for Alice here. Is there a central place to learn or discuss how core safeguarding terms have been translated into different languages? Where is the best place to go?
Very good question. We have a number of glossaries on our website, and you're very welcome to look there. We have not yet been able to produce a SEA specific glossary, multilingual glossary. We would love to. Anyone who'd like to fund us to do it, please come our way.
Good plug there for more funding for both translation and I think for the visual communications as well. Desiree, when will round 2 be happening so that boys with disabilities will be included? Also, how are issues around the LGBTQ community handled? In some countries we work with, there is denial that these people exist, and indeed it is illegal. We want to use these visuals to first explore these issues within our teams. Do you have any experience or tips?
Round 2 is, and this is not a plug, as Alice stated, in terms of funding dependent. We probably will not be looking until, quite frankly, 2022 to look at it because of the heavy lift. It was to create the first round of these visuals, but we are looking and have applied for several funding in terms of the consortium that brought forth those visuals. So we hope that answer will be soon enough, but we don't have a definitive for you there. Apologies. And in terms of the LGBTQI community, what I will say is, unfortunately, because of the COVID context, we have not been able to test these as much as we would like with subgroups in terms of its utilization. I would encourage you that if you have a particular access within your programming and targeting and protection, see how these visuals resonate and have that communication with those individuals to say, how do you want to be communicated to, and introduce that as the your test group in terms of how to utilize it and be able to take it forward. What we have found, and I'll give you an example within utilizing that female as the perpetrator, is there is an incredible amount of awareness building if the community is in denial that it's even occurring or something even exists. There's a considerable amount of awareness building that needs to occur that this is a reality before we can get to those key messages about that reality. So just remember that it might be a multi-step process and to not jump to a visual to solve more of a capacity building, awareness building, programmatic intent.
There's an interesting question there, which I think you've touched upon in what you were just saying, but let's unpack this a bit more. How much is having female perpetrators reflective of reality in the context intended versus the equality or even-handed agenda of the CSO community?
I think it's important to realize that these were purposely created to be utilized from a global perspective and a little bit more of a generic perspective. While it was taken into account, key considerations, we can't create one thing that's level set for the globe, right? Because every place is individual. So I appreciate that it's a little bit of an oxymoron here. What I'm saying is we've created a global toolkit for you to utilize locally. You know that from a male victim perspective, it is one of the most underrepresented reporting. So we felt very strongly, particularly when we were talking to safeguarding officers around the world and those that were engaged in gender-based violence and other aspects that were part of our testing, that this was a key part that was missing. So what we felt is that it was very strong in terms of if there is a key constituency that is underreporting, to target that area to raise greater awareness. So maybe not exact answer to your question, but more of the intent of why that was chosen.
Thank you, Desiree. And speaking from a safeguarding practitioner's point of view, I would say, yes, there absolutely are women who are perpetrators in this area, just from my personal experience of investigating cases. So we have a question from Bethlehem who says, how do you see the importance of pre-test while producing IEC and promotional materials? Since context and local communities' perception plays a role in understanding the messages we try to send across. I think if both of you would like to answer that one, that would be helpful.
I'm happy to go first. I mean, we would see pre-test as absolutely crucial. It's a fantastic way to find out whether your messages are being clearly understood, to understand whether there are some groups in the community who receive that message differently. For example, whether you're going to need to produce 2 different sets to cater for different levels of understanding, or just different ways of using terms or the kind of words that people are expected would understand. So we would thoroughly recommend pre-testing and doing a second revision.
Desiree.
Absolutely. And I'll take it a little bit from a different angle rather than a technical angle. I will take it from the safeguarding angle. We are trying to build trust. We want to be participatory. We want to be respectful, right? And the way to do that is to make sure it is included. And if we look at diversity, equity, inclusion, right, we need to have not only see ourselves at the table, but have a voice at that table and have that voice listened to. So I would encourage you to, not only from a technical perspective, you will absolutely receive a better product that will better resonate and get you to your goals and outcomes better. But not only just from that technical perspective, but from that cultural relationship perspective, you will build a stronger relationship with those communities that you are working within, because they are part of the process, not for me, without me.
Great message. Thank you, Desiree. A question now for Alice. Mohammed says, any guidance in the case that there's no exact or perfect translation for some of the terminologies?
Yes, I guess so. It's a very good point, a very good question. There are many cases where there's no exact equivalent in terms. So a good translator should, you might need to talk to a good translator about exactly what that term is intended to mean, and then help them to find a short phrase, for example, that's a good equivalent. I think it's partly also very important when we're developing source material that we work alongside translators to identify what are going to be problematic terms. We might use something very colloquial, like, opening a webinar with housekeeping, but housekeeping, is a term that doesn't necessarily translate in other than sweeping the floor, so you need to be able to work with people to kind of understand what are the colloquialisms and eliminate them, and then be able to find an equivalent colloquialism if necessary. So it doesn't have to be term for term, but meaning for meaning. And a good translator should be able to work with you to do that.
Thank you, Alice. Great answer. I think we've got time for one more question, and this one is to Desiree. It's from Michael. Do you consider different countries' domestic laws before conducting visualization, and how are the materials locally law inclusive?
Answer, absolutely yes. And that should automatically be one of your key localization contextualizations that need to be done. So from that people cultural perspective and environmental perspective, and I would say that's part almost of the environment, not just of the physical geographical environment, but what is that environment as well from a legislative context. The question was asked earlier in terms of the LGBTQI community, and we do know that there are certain legislative contexts where that is illegal to identify as a member of that community. So what we would not want to do is necessarily be too provocative to the point where we are upsetting officials and or the communities themselves to be seen as promoting illegal activity. Want to be clear though, the visualizations that were created, this is a general toolkit to be further contextualized, right? So these should not be taken off the shelf and just automatically utilized. The toolkit is given a breadth of different characters, different backgrounds, ability to edit the text, put in the necessary text, so that you all that are utilizing these materials and wonderful messages that Translators Without Borders was able to create to contextualize them themselves to the legislative context. I am not condoning, obviously, legislation against LGBTQI communities, rather stating that that's something we need to acknowledge that is out there and be sensitive towards, and acknowledge that there's other programming that work towards enhancing those rights.
Thank you. That's a fantastic answer, Desiree, and a really, really good point to finish on. I think it looks like we have lost Semhal, unfortunately, who was having connection issues in joining us from Ethiopia. Hopefully she might have a chance to rejoin just to help us close the webinar today. But in the meantime, thank you, of course, to both our panelists. I will thank you in a little bit more detail at the close of the webinar. But what I'd like us to do first is to draw your attention to our feedback poll, which we're going to be sharing with you shortly. This is a very brief poll that enables us to find out if this webinar has been useful to you in order that we can provide webinars in the future that are suitable for your needs. So you should see on your screen right now a very quick poll that you can provide answers to. So if you would be able to do that for us, that would be extremely helpful. Thank you. I'll just give a minute for people to see that. Okay. So thank you very much for that. It does look as though Semhal has not been able to join us for the close of the webinar. So I would like to say thank you for Semhal for kicking us off and doing such a great job of introducing this webinar and introducing our panelists. And it's a shame that she wasn't able to join us for the close. But that's all we have time for today. So thanks again, obviously, to our speakers for their informative presentations. I found that absolutely fascinating myself, and I hope all of our audience did as well. And thank you, all of you, for your really engaging and challenging questions there. I think there's some really interesting questions that you put to our speakers. So thank you for that. As we've mentioned in the Q&A, we will be sharing this webinar recording with you, as well as the slides that we used. So you'll be receiving those shortly after this webinar. We'll also be including in that email some links to resources that we think you might find helpful around the subjects that we've discussed here in today's webinar. If you would like to hear more about future Safeguarding Resource and Support Hub webinars, please do subscribe to our newsletter. You will find the link appearing in the Q&A shortly, hopefully. So that's all from us today. So thank you once again. I hope you enjoyed this webinar, and we look forward to connecting with you again in the future. Thank you.